Maintenant, je passe la parole à Yann Tkaczow. Tkaczow. Ah, on ne prononce pas le T. Bah, ouais, mais attendez, je vais prendre quelques cours de polonais. Donc, qui est psychanalyste et membre du forum polonais à Varsovie.
Merci, Patrick. I will be the first person speaking English, so you might be shocked a bit. And I want to thank the organizers for organizing such a great conference, and also the transcription that you can follow on those screens. So whoever does not understand English, you can follow the French version on there. And of course, I want to thank the organizers for having me here and inviting me here. It's a great pleasure. My title is Why Speaking Helps, parentheses, but only if you don't know anything about me. My intervention is based on the difference which Lacan stresses in Seminar Encore. That is the difference between little a and S à barré. I hope you can see it on the screens, what I'm talking about. He says, the aim of my teaching is to dissociate little a and grand A. And yet, little a has lent itself to be confused with S à barré, below which is written on the blackboard. And in this point, he is referring to the tab of the sexuation that he is creating. And it has done so by means of the function of being. It is there that a scission or detachment remains to be effectuated. It is in this respect that psychoanalysis is something other than psychology. For psychology is this uneffectuated scission. We also meet little a under S à barré in a much earlier formulation, i.e. in the graph of desire. Already in the subversion of the subject, Lacan points out to the discrepancy between the signifier of the lack in the other, big other, which means only that the other is divided by jouissance, lacking, and the object cause of desire, which, through the operation of the signifier, endows with meaning in the place of nonsense, creating the phantasm, the symptom, and the subject. In this text, Lacan says, and I'm quoting, desire institutes a dominance in the privileged place of jouissance of object A in fantasy, which desire substitutes for à barré. And then, perversion is in the neurotic's unconscious in the guise of the other's fantasy. And then, providing it oscillates and by alternating between S barré and little a in fantasy, castration makes of fantasy a chain that is both supple and inextensible, by which the fixation of object cathexis takes on the transcendental function of ensuring the jouissance of the other that passes this chain onto me in the law. These are really hard quotations, but we can discuss it later. What differs psychoanalysis from other forms of psychotreatments is that it doesn't confuse little a with S à barré. In the subversion of the subject, Lacan underlines that little a of the fantasy originates from S à barré of the other, and then joins, meets, or separates out the S barré in the process. And I have this little schema here, and I'm not sure if you can see it on the screens, but if not, then I'm sorry. Now I'd like to explain the title. The intervention is based on two texts which I wrote earlier, Why Speaking Helps, and they were titled Why Speaking Helps and You Don't Know Anything About Me. These texts were directed at general public. I want to reuse two leitmotifs that I used in them. One is Plato's cave, and the other is solipsism of the subject, better known in our circles as there is something of the one, Jodlę. Thus, I state the following as regards you don't know anything about me. as I posited in the original text. One, it might be that the subject utters these words to I, to moi, to ich. Or object A utters these words to the subject, the divided subject. Or as du utters these words to as on, as two to as one. In other words, subject turns to knowledge, and knowledge responds, you don't know anything about me. In this approach, Yadleu is a protection of ignorance, but it's understandable. It is most intimate relation to jouissance, of which there is no way one could find out before analysis. Using a method to communicate with general public doesn't have to mean that we're making things easier. A catchphrase is good enough. Lacan was a master of catchphrases. We have heard many quotations today already. You all know that. We need to trick the audience as we trick newcomer analysants. I know this will raise questions, so I explain a priori. We need to aim at discerning that little a differs from s abaret. This we know. And the trick? Where's the trick? The trick is in the subject. It starts to believe in other knowing because he himself knows. Thus, formatting, the subject supposed to know. But we cannot know. What is his difference? So yes, in the end, it is not a trick, but still requires some buffonade on our part. And that, again, Lacan was a master of. So where does it lead me? You don't know anything about me is a catchphrase, which works because it is so common and commonly used, but no one dares to explain it. And we need to be there. And so is the same with why speaking helps. There is not a single psychological article that I would come across that would explain it to general public. Not that I would suspect that our colleagues know it themselves. Because speaking only helps if you know what is the difference between little a and s abaret. Again, we need to be there. And what does it mean, this we need to be there, that I am repeating to you, making it another catchphrase? Lacan states in the position of the unconscious, we need to be there, as our intervention needs to meet the cleavage of little a and s abaret. He's using the Platonic cave as an example. The opening and closing of the unconscious is done nowhere else but in Parole. Psychoanalyst waits at the cave's gate, but, as we know from the same text, this sesame opens only on a password open sesame, spoken from the inside. So, he waits, the psychoanalyst waits, and then what? And then has to recognize the cleavage between A and S abaret to drop the stone of the interpretation between the doors. It will obviously be crushed by the power of repression, but we're still there, waiting for another call, and when it arrives, another stone flies between the doors. This is all, of course, metaphorically speaking. This may be, or maybe in 100th time, it will eventually meet with the crumbs of previous stones, and they start to mount an obstacle to closing that cave. Now I'll try to give you a short clinical example of how I understand what I just stated. A hysteric woman, in her 6th year of analysis, brings a dream to a session. She sits on a blanket outside her house on an empty driveway. She looks like she just got out of the shower. She wears a robe and a turban towel on her hair. Her 3-year-old daughter plays with a gate, repeatedly opening and closing it with a push of a button. Everything in the dream is actually opposite to what her statements say. She hates being seen by her neighbors, and the driver is the most exposed spot in her home lot. And she was sick that her daughter could open the gate and run out on a busy street. Needless to say, in the dream, she is totally relaxed and smokes a cigarette. She was talking recently about her father as a cheater, a con man, asserting to her surprise that it is him who is afraid of being cheated. Father, by many indications, my hypothesis, is probably a paranoid subject. So she says, and voila, what a crook. And then she realized that it is easy for her to judge him, but she is not certain how she would behave in such a situation. And on that base, she says, she suspects herself of having ugly, which is a special Polish word here as a signifier, ugly character. It caused my questioning her if she considers herself being a crook. How and why is it possible that she dreamed such a dream, that everything is opposite in it? In the end, I asked her if she had any associations with seeing herself sitting there with this towel, robe, and cigarette on the blanket, all relaxed and everything. My push was toward my own imagination, I have to admit, that of a pin-up girl. But the surprise and reward comes shortly just for just being there and listening, not knowing. She says, I remind myself of my grandmother from my father's side, she replies to her astonishment. She wore constantly those turban towels. And she was a pretty ugly character. I end the session remembering from a few years back how she told me stories of her repugnance and disgust of her grandmother. We see here inevitable meeting at the genealogical tree, which Lacan mentions in the Note Italienne. But as he continues there, to finish at this would be a mistake, which Freud didn't know what to do about. This is what brings us to the level of work with the signifier and the lack. We remain enigmatic about it, even though the subject will immediately feel guilt and shame. We can hypothesize that maybe she saw this as the only way to avoid the madness of her father, to treat him as his mother did. We don't know that yet, so we need to keep our mouths shut. But we can push without a thesis or even with it, but kept in reserve. Once the subject found the other lacking, as abaret, in which way it will remain secret, because the father here is not a lacking subject, that's for sure. And the subject in analysis, my patient, she struggles with it her entire life. Once she found him lacking, as abaret, she makes of it the little a of her fantasy, a sword and a shield of it. It is precisely what you don't know about me. And thus, armed with this oneness, subject will cheat, intrigue, fight, and symptomatize, if you allow me, her entire life to protect her ignorance of how she become and what she is. So to conclude, we only need to know what is the difference between little a and asabaret in order to keep our mouths shut and not to pursue the phantasmatic ideals of our own, which we find so often in the work of our colleagues from the field of psychiatry, psychology, and psychotherapy. This reminds me of another leitmotif from Why Speaking Helps, this text that I already written, that of measuring the effects of a treatment, which is a big buzzword in psychology. How do we measure the effects of the treatment? And I state the following. For psychiatrists, case is simple. It's biochemistry. For psychologists, it's a bit harder. It's the test. It's the tests. For psychotherapists, it's confusing because it's a happiness of man. Only for us, it is complicated beyond any scope. It's a satisfaction of existence.